Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, he was the first official to leave the U.S. government over the war in Gaza.
I didn't think that over a year and a half later, we would still see the bombs dropping.
With so much changing in the State Department, we talked to Josh Paul about U.S. policy towards Israel-Palestine and what he's doing to influence it from the outside. I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take.
My name is Josh Paul. I am director and co-founder of an organization called A New Policy, which is an American lobbying organization focused on U.S. politics and policy towards Palestine and Israel. I previously served in the State Department for over a decade in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs.
It's really great to have you on the show. Let's talk about what's happening in Gaza right now. I mean, Israel and Hamas are having ceasefire talks in Doha. At the same time, Israel's expanding its ground offensive. You know, they're escalating, not scaling back. So how do you see what's happening there?
So obviously what is happening is an absolute tragedy. What we see now with Israel's escalation, it's hard to describe it with any terms other than ethnic cleansing. Israel has been very clear that it is trying to move people certainly out of the north of Gaza. I believe there are only about 100,000 left there now. All of the hospitals in the north of Gaza have been struck, damaged, or destroyed in the last few days. This is obviously deeply concerning and, perhaps the start of a continuing operation to drive the people of Gaza as far south as Israel can as part of an effort to permanently occupy or reoccupy the Gaza Strip militarily.
Right. And by this point, we are 19 and a half months into this war. Did you think that it was going to ever go on this long?
No, I didn't. At the time I resigned, it had already gone on for 10 days. There were already 3,500 people who had been killed. I thought that at that point it might go on for another few weeks, at most a couple of months. I didn't think that over a year and a half later, we would still see the bombs dropping on Gaza. We would still see the suffering, and that we would indeed see right now an expanded forcible starvation, where there are 14,000 babies, for example, who the UN had said are at immediate risk of death from starvation. This has been beyond imagination.
Beyond imagination, and it doesn't seem to stop. Now, it's been more than a year and a half since you resigned from your position at the State Department over U.S. arms being sent to Israel. Now, this was under the Biden administration, but you, as you said, you worked there for over a decade, helping to facilitate the sale of weapons from the U.S. to foreign partners and allies, even some with questionable human rights records. So, Josh, what happened after October 7th that was the breaking point for you?
So first of all, I think we need to back up, and I'll just say that as a civil servant, I think all of us who work in the U.S. government join to try to do our part to make the world a better place. And in doing so, we recognize that by joining the US government, we're joining a vast enterprise that we are not going to sort of change at the click of a finger, that changes are incremental, that it is a very large ship of state that does take time to turn. But during my time in the State Department, in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, I had always felt that I was doing a little bit more good than I would be by not being present. That, even in the context of arms transfers and security assistance to countries with poor human rights records, I was able to raise concerns, to engage in policy discussions about what we could do to mitigate some of those concerns. And there was always, at the very least, the space to make those incremental changes. What transpired in October of 2023 was fundamentally different, and in two ways. The first was a question of scope and scale.
Thousands of people have been killed in Gaza, entire neighborhoods flattened, and even hospitals attacked during Israel's military offensive on the Strip.
The use of American weaponry, of American aircraft, American bombs by Israel in the context of Gaza at that time, 3,500 people had been killed in the first 10 days alone, was different than any partnered operation that I'd ever seen while I had been there, just in terms of the amount of harm that was being done, the amount of people who were being killed, innocent people who were being killed. The other difference was that space to make any sort of difference within the system went away. That unlike the regular arms transfer process, which is a bottom-up process in which you can raise concerns and address them before senior decision makers give the go-ahead. In this case, the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, were directing us to approve all of the requests that were coming in from Israel, regardless of the harm that was being done. And so I tried to raise my voice in those first days, and was told, this isn't a question for debate. And so in the absence of being able to make any sort of difference, that's the reason that I decided that there was no point in being a part of that system, and I stepped down.
Mm-hmm. And since October 7th, the Biden administration has spent more than $17 billion on military aid for Israel. I mean, that's an astounding amount, right? And under Trump, I think billions more. That's a lot of money, a lot of weapons, and a very, very high death toll. More than 50,000 Palestinians have been killed. Some people say that number is much, much higher. And we know that a lot of those are women and children. Maybe you could tell us what kinds of U.S. weapons have been used, U.S. supplied weapons have been used in Gaza since October of last year. What does the public need to know about the weapons being sent there?
So really, it's almost everything. From the firearms that many of the soldiers use on the ground, and of course, we've seen multiple incidents of children being shot by snipers. Those sniper rifles are, in most likely case, American origin, as are many of the guns that the regular soldiers are using. When you're talking about the armored vehicles on the ground, Israel, of course, makes its own tanks, but they are made with American parts and components, including the engines and the treads. More significantly, perhaps, the air-to-ground munitions, the bombs that are being dropped. Certainly, almost all of the explosive bombs that are being dropped are of American origin, including the 2,000-pound bombs that Israel has been dropping that can devastate an entire city block in one go.
2,000-pound bombs were dropped on a routine basis in South Gaza during the first 6 weeks of the war. Most,
if not all, of the guidance kits that are used to guide some of those bombs, not all of them. As we know, Israel has also been dropping what we call dumb bombs or unguided bombs. And of course, the airplanes themselves. Every single fixed-wing aircraft in Israel's fleet is made in America. So there is significant American munitions and contributions to Israel's capabilities here. In fact, Israel would not be able to conduct itself in the way that it has been doing without both the American weapons and the constant resupply and supply of those weapons.
Mm-hmm. Whenever you see one of those huge 2,000-pound bombs that are supplied by the United States being dropped on Gaza, on tent encampments there, on civilians, how do you process that?
So first of all, I will say, as a technical matter, that is not what those bombs are intended for. They are intended for military targets that are, for example, aircraft that are being stored in shelters or for massed troops. They are not intended for use in densely populated civilian areas because they cannot discriminate by nature between civilian populations and military targets. They are weapons that are designed to cause as much damage as possible within a very wide blast radius. And of course, just looking at the explosive power that has been dropped on Gaza in the last year and a half, it is already many multiples of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima.
Wow.
So there's been an immense amount of explosive power. I think there's also another impact when we are talking about the 2,000-pound bombs specifically, which is that for targets that are underground, these actually push, as a result of the explosion, toxic gases and carbon monoxide down through, for example, any underground tunnels. So if Israel is arguing that it is acting to essentially save or rescue its own hostages, these are bombs that will absolutely contribute to the death of anyone who is in any tunnels that may be in any way connected, or any underground basements, for example. And there is no way to limit that harm.
So if getting the hostages isn't the goal here because of the kinds of weapons that they're using, then what is the goal?
Well, first of all, I think we know that getting the hostages is not the goal because Israel has had many diplomatic opportunities starting in October of 2023 to advance negotiations, to conclude negotiations that would support getting the hostages out. And they've been very clear that that is not their primary goal. I think Israel's declared primary goal, of course, is defeating and destroying Hamas. We can talk about that because I do not think that this operation can possibly achieve that in the way it is being conducted. But I think it is very clear that Israel's goal is to punish innocent civilians. That is, of course, a collective punishment that is a violation of international law, and to destroy Gaza. It is to exact vengeance, not to advance any sort of meaningful political objective.
And this is sanctioned by the United States government and paid for by the United States government in many cases. Let's talk a little bit about how we got here and the Biden administration. Michael Herzog, this was a little shocking to me. Michael Herzog, the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. in an investigation done by Israel's Channel 13, said recently, and I quote, "God did the state of Israel a favor that Biden was the president during this period." He went on to say that the administration was never really pressuring them for a ceasefire. Now, that completely contradicts what the Biden administration was saying. Does that line up with what you knew of the State Department's approach?
Yes, it does. I don't think there was ever any meaningful indication beyond public statements by the Biden administration that there was any sort of real push for a ceasefire, because there would have been a ceasefire if there had been. The United States of America has significant leverage over the government of Israel, not only through the supply of weapons, but through the sharing of intelligence, the provision of diplomatic support, economic support, that, the government of Israel would have to respond to if any of those levers were actually pulled. So I think it's been very clear to all of us in Washington, D.C., that there was never, despite the Biden administration's declarations and protestations, a real effort to come to a ceasefire. Quite the contrary, there was a willingness, even a desire, I think, on the part of some of the American leadership under the Biden administration to continue to flow the weapons, to continue to enable this mass slaughter.
It makes me a little sick to my stomach when I hear that. I mean, the Biden administration purported to care about human rights, correct? Why didn't the Biden administration do more to prevent or stop what many are now calling a genocide in Gaza?
So I think that we have to acknowledge that there is an exception for Israel. I think that the Biden administration did indeed come to office purporting to put human rights at the center of foreign policy. As Secretary of State Blinken himself said very early on in the Biden administration, they certainly took some steps in those early days to address some of the concerns that had risen previously. For example, in the space of arms transfers and human rights, putting into place a new policy that said that weapons will not be transferred to other partners when they are more likely than not to be used to commit violations of international law or to kill children, for example. All of these policies, all of these commitments very quickly went out of the window when it came to Israel and when, in the context of 2023. But then I think more broadly at a political level, both within the Biden administration and across the United States Congress, for the most part, there are political economic incentives that when it comes to Israel, it's most often a race to see who can be the most supportive of whatever, in this case, Prime Minister Netanyahu wants. And that has really dug us into a hole here in which we have placed Netanyahu's interests ahead of our own.
After the break, more with Josh. Let's talk about Trump. Now, I know that you're no longer at the State Department, but I imagine that you still know people who are working there. What are they telling you about how the department is currently being run by Trump and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio?
I'm hearing not only from former colleagues in the State Department, but from people across the US government who are deeply concerned about some of the cuts that are being made by what they call the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which has a lot of people essentially either sort of keeping their heads down and looking for jobs outside of government. We've also lost a lot of capability. USAID, the main agency responsible for US global humanitarian assistance, of course, is being deconstructed before our eyes, as are some of the key capabilities in the State Department when it comes to refugee and migration support, or when it comes to conflict stabilization expertise. The other thing is that up to this point, my understanding from former colleagues at the State Department is that most of the Middle East policy, particularly as it relates to Israel and Palestine, has been run essentially out of the White House, out of special envoys working for President Trump directly, and cutting out the State Department in great part.
And we know, that Trump and Netanyahu are pretty tight.
Trump and Netanyahu have been tight, but there are also very clearly some tensions. dating back to the end of the previous Trump administration. So that is a tension that we see resurfacing now, I think, in the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. I think there are some significant continuities between the first Trump administration and this one, and there are some disconnects. Certainly, the continuing interest in arms transfers, and we just saw the president return from a trip to the Middle East, where a number of large commitments were made for the procurement of American arms.
So, Josh, after leaving the government, you helped form a lobbying group aimed at reshaping U.S. Middle East policy. And part of that is really trying to convince people that this unconditional U.S. support for Israel is not actually in our national interest. Maybe you could sort of lay out the case for me of why it's not.
Sure. So when we look at U.S. unconditional military support for Israel, particularly in the last 18 months, but well before then, we see, first of all, a complete disconnect with American values, right? When we think about our own history, when we think about how America supposedly stands for freedom, for the rights of individuals, these are rights that we are seeing being trampled across, certainly the West Bank and, of course, Gaza as well. And that is something that should, I think, be deeply concerning to all Americans. But more than that, there are a whole set of American national interests that we are also doing incredible and probably lasting damage to. For example, when America speaks on the world stage about human rights, when we reproach adversaries, countries like Russia, for example, about their human rights record, the hypocrisy of our continuing unconditional military support to Israel, to its occupation, to its aggression, just shreds our credibility. America's posture is also doing significant harm to our relationships across the world. We see this playing out, for example, at the United Nations, where again and again, we find the United States with Israel and perhaps one or two other countries isolated in votes. And there's a domestic angle here too. Not only are we sending billions of taxpayer dollars to pay for these weapons, that is money that is going to add to our national debt that our children and our grandchildren are going to be paying off for decades to come. But we are also conducting an assault on our own constitutional rights, on our First Amendment rights, to repress free speech. Not free speech that is critical of the United States, not free speech that is critical of elected politicians, free speech that is critical of a foreign country. And so how any of this is in our national interest is, I think, beyond me and I think beyond everyone who thinks about it.
Now, I want to bring up something that just happened, right? So just this Wednesday night, we saw a shooting in the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. 2 Israeli embassy staff were tragically shot.
There's been a shooting outside the Capitol Jewish Museum. At least 2 people have been killed.
The suspect chanted, "Free, free Palestine," while in custody.
Now, the fact that there was this incident seemingly related to what's going on in Gaza, spilling onto U.S. soil, I mean, it's being described as an act of anti-Semitism. What does this incident tell you about the climate around this issue?
So, first of all, and let me be clear, both I and my organization, A New Policy, condemn this shooting unreservedly. The use of violence, political violence, is absolutely unconscionable, whether it occurs in the United States or anywhere else. I don't think we know enough yet about the shooter to say exactly, what his motivations were. It's been reported that he, shouted political slogans, but I think we need to know more before we can really understand and assess what is happening here. At the same time, I think it is, the risk here is that people will take advantage of this horrific incident to pursue different agendas. Some will say, look, you see, this is, what you get. And some will say, look, you see, this is the anti-Semitism that we're talking about. I think it is too early to say either of those things. And I think probably, in fact, neither of them are accurate.
Speaking out about or your opposition to U.S.-Israel alliances is not going to win you a ton of friends in Washington. You know, there's a real culture of fear around speaking out, and we know that there is a very strong pro-Israel lobby who spends lots and lots of money on politicians and on elections. How is your organization being received in Washington?
So it's early days. We launched 7 months ago. So far, I would have to say, though, that we have actually, for the most part, been welcomed with open doors. One of the things that Tariq Abash, who is the co-founder of the organization, and I discovered in the months after each of us resigned, as we went up to Congress and we met with United States senators, with United States representatives, is that very often what you hear behind closed doors is very different to what you hear in public. So, for example, I had a conversation with a United States senator who said that I know what we are doing is wrong. I know that our weapons are being used to commit war crimes by Israel, but you understand that I can't say that publicly. It's that piece that we are trying to get at. I think behind the scenes, people understand it's been made very clear to everyone, I think, by the images that have been coming out, that what is happening is fundamentally immoral, is fundamentally wrong. The challenge that we have to overcome in many cases is just giving people the support they need to be able to say that publicly, to be able to shift their public statements and shift their votes. And to do that, you have to look at American political structures and the American political system. It is not enough, unfortunately, simply to be out on the streets protesting, simply for students, for example, to be organizing encampments in their colleges and universities. You have to channel this energy, this momentum into American politics in a way that American politics is designed to respond to. And that means a professional lobbying effort that is up there in Congress and meeting with the executive branch every day, delivering accurate and trustworthy information in both open and in confidential settings. It means taking that energy on the streets and delivering it into the ballot box and demonstrating strength at the ballot box. And in our system, it also means money, right? Money is an important part of the American political system, unfortunately. But, you know, at a time when AIPAC can spend $100 million in an election cycle to get America to act against its interest, I think the good news here is that we can spend significantly less than that to right the balance and get America to act in its own interest.
Well, Josh, thank you again for coming on The Take. This was a really fascinating discussion.
No, thank you very much indeed for having me.
And that's The Take. If you're short on time but still want to catch the highlights, check out our YouTube Shorts. We post quick clips with the best moments from our episodes that you won't want to miss. It's a great way to stay connected. So check them out, and I'll see you tomorrow.